Hey guys, welcome back. Today's an exciting day in the garage with the 2019 Toyota Tacoma. We're going to be replacing the front spacer lift. We have Rad Flow coilovers. We'll open up the box in just a second. And while we're working on the front end, we're going to go ahead and swap out the front rotors. It has a slight vibration under braking at highway speeds. Here are the Bosch QuietCast rotors that we're going to install. I've used these before on other vehicles. They work great. These are the Rad Flow 2.0 extended travel Toyota Tacoma coilovers. The spring rates are 550 pounds per inch. That's a little less than what I understand the stock spring rate to be, so it should help smooth the ride. But the biggest reason that I'm going with these is to replace the spacer and also give me some adjustability on my ride height by adjusting these spring keepers up and down. So we have the Tacoma up on jack stands, front tires removed, so we'll go ahead and get started. So this is the left front suspension on our Toyota Tacoma. You can see the spacer right here. All it does is space this front coilover down and push further down on the lower control arm and thus raising the ride height. It does okay for certain applications. However, it can create problems by overextending this ball joint. These are aftermarket Old Man Emu upper control arms. I don't know if this ball joint is at an angle enough that it could damage this ball joint. We're going to take it apart and look at it. But it can also damage the CV axles by allowing the A-arm to extend too low and putting the CV axles in a bind. Coilovers that we have from Rad Flow are extended travel, but they're not quite as long as this setup with the stock coilover with the spacer on top. Once we get this pulled out, I'm going to lay them out and take some measurements and see how much longer this setup is with the spacer compared to the extended travel Rad Flow coilovers. The first step to removing this coilover is disconnecting the sway bar links. And to do that, you'll have to have both front tires removed and supported by jack stands. So we'll go ahead and remove this one nut right here. I'm going to run around and remove the nut on the other side, and then we should be able to swing this sway bar up out of the way. We have both of the sway bar end links removed on both sides, one on each side. It won't let me raise the sway bar up because it's hitting on the spindle here, but we're going to remove these two nuts on the bottom, and I'll be able to slide that out where we can get this up and out of the way. Hopefully it's not hitting on the other side, but we'll see. We're gonna have to go to the other side and remove the two bottom bolts on the bottom of the lower ball joint bolts, because this sway bar is still hitting on the spindle on the other side, so I can't lift it up high enough. So let's go to the other side. We'll remove those two bolts and come back. Now that sway bar is up out of the way, so we should be able to loosen these nuts on the top, push this spindle forward slightly, and slide it right out through here. We might end up having to take off the front tie rod, not sure, we'll just have to see what happens. Just gonna loosen this last one up. Don't wanna take it off completely. We'll leave that on there so that once we loosen this bottom bolt up, it's still supported in the coilover housing there. We're gonna remove this nut and bolt right here on the bottom of the coilover. And that is a 19 millimeter nut. 17 millimeter is the biggest we have in the Craftsman set, so we're gonna have to go dig and see if we can find a loose 19 millimeter, and there it is. trying to figure out what is holding it up. On my GX470, we had a spacer on this sway bar that moved this forward. The reason that this is so hard to get out is because this spacer lift has lengthened this coilover and longer than it's supposed to be, and it's not wanting to come out of this little bucket where the end of the shock connects to the A-arm. We removed the two sway bar mounting bolts that were right here on either side of the sway bar. We were hoping that this would enable it to slide forward enough to get it out of the way where it's not preventing us from getting this coilover out. However, it's still in a bind on the other side, so we're gonna have to go remove those same two bolts from the other side and slide this sway bar forward. I was able to get the factory coilover out with the spacer. I actually had to remove this spacer. There are 3 bolts or 3 nuts on the end. I had to remove those 3, take this spacer off, and then I was able to get the top of the coilover between the CV axle and the front tie rod. With this spacer is just a little bit larger than the diameter of the top hat on this coilover. That was part of the problem, but more so was the thickness. I wasn't able to turn it at a little bit of an angle and slide it between the coilover and the tie rod, so I just used my impact wrench, removed those 2 or 3 14mm nuts, slid the spacer off, and was able to pull it out no problem. So I just put the spacer back on so I could get some measurements. With the differences in the lengths of these bolts and this center rod extending through the end, and the fact that this top plate on the OEM coilover is actually at a little bit of an angle, it's proving to be difficult to get a precise measurement of the length of the OEM coilover with the spacer. I'm just going to try to use a tape measure and get close. I think we're probably about a 1/2 inch longer on the OEM coilover with the spacer, but we'll take some measurements and see what we come up with. This is actually at an angle kind of like this, so I'm gonna pick a spot in the middle and I'm gonna go to the top edge of this hole right there. I mean, that is almost exactly 23 inches on the OEM coilover plus the spacer. I have this joint at the top set pretty level. It's almost completely vertical. So we're gonna take a measurement here, and I can't really get right on it. A little bit of guesstimation looking at it overhead, I'm going to say, I'm gonna call that like 22 3/8. That is 5/8 of an inch shorter than the OEM setup with the coil spacer. 5/8 to a 1/2 inch. So we're getting ready to install our first Rad Flow coilover, but first, Permatex anti-seize. This is what it was made for, aluminum on aluminum. It's going to be hard to get anti-seize on the back side of the coilover once it's installed, so I'm going to go ahead and apply some on the shock body itself. I don't know if I'm going to have to adjust these up or down. I can't get it below the shock collar because the spring is in the way, but I can get it above there, and if I have to wipe it off later, I can, but it'll be easier to put it on now before I install the coilover. I think that's good. Should just slide right back in there Also, this is not a paid endorsement for Permatex or anti-seize. Just wanted to make that clear. Now I'm going to reinsert this bolt through the bottom part of the shock or coilover. Since we've loosened these bolts up on the mounting point, the front mounting point of the sway bar, I think I can go ahead and reconnect this side. We're going to leave these front mounting bolts out for the sway bar bracket, but I'm going to go ahead and connect the sway bar to the spindle. Okay, now we're going to line up these bolts on the bottom of the spindle. These bolts still have some red Loctite on them, so we're good to go. Okay, there's one. We're done on the driver's side. We just have our bolts for the sway bar bracket and our lug nuts to reinstall the wheel. We're gonna move over to the passenger side, do the same process all over. Okay, there we go. One OEM coilover minus the spacer removed. Something I didn't realize when I was taking this apart is that one side of this bracket for the sway bar has a notch. If I had known that, that would have made it a lot easier. Loosen this bolt, take this one out, and then slide this out. So it might be difficult to determine which side has the slot and which side has the full circle, but if you can determine that when you're taking this bracket off, it'll make removal a lot easier. It certainly makes reassembly a lot easier also. We've wrapped up the suspension install, so now we're going to move on to brakes. The Tacoma has a vibration when applying the brakes at highway speeds. I checked into having these rotors turned. There's plenty of material left to have them turned, but the price I was given was more than it would cost me to buy rotors and replace them myself, so that's what I decided to do. To do that, we're going to remove the brake pads, remove the bolts that hold the caliper and the bracket in place, bungee tie that up out of the way, pull the rotor off, clean the new rotor off with some brake clean, and do everything in reverse. As I mentioned in the intro, I've used these Bosch rotors before. I really like them. They have a nice anti-rust coating on them. They're not the most expensive, not the nicest rotor, but I think they're going to do good for us. Just using regular O'Reilly Auto Parts brake cleaner next to Permatex anti-seize. This is probably my favorite chemical to use in the garage. These brake pads have plenty of life left in them. I don't know that this is a necessary step, but given that they're already kind of polished, shiny, I'm going to take some sandpaper and just lightly scuff up the surface of this before I reinstall these. All I did was really kind of just buff the shine off of it. There's the inside pad. Now we're going to do the same thing to this outside pad. Okay, and then reinstall that one. Now we're going to reinstall this little spring to help spread the brake pads apart, help give you better miles per gallon. And just reinstall these pins. Make sure it goes through this spring like that right there, and then has a little clip here on the end. Thank you, Mr. Toyota, for making brake pad changes super easy. I know we did a little more than change brake pads, but if you do have to change brake pads, it's a super easy process. Look at all the shiny silver parts. We're all wrapped up here. We went for a quick test drive. The suspension seems smooth and no issues as far as vibration in the brakes. So we're gonna drive this for a few days. We may come back and adjust the ride height that's sitting about 3/8 of an inch below what it was before we took the spacer lift off. We liked the way that it looked before. Would it be okay the way it is now? I don't know. That's what we're gonna try to determine over the next couple of days. All in all, great day in the garage. So thanks for joining us. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more off-road builds and outdoor adventures.